The late afternoon sun beat down on the cracked asphalt, a quiet rest stop, along an empty stretch of highway. It was one of those places people stopped briefly, refueled, grabbed a snack, and moved on, never giving it much thought. But on this particular day, it became the unlikely stage for a moment that would forever alter lives. The sound of chirping crickets blended with the occasional hum of a passing car. A faded vending machine stood in the shade of a few scraggly trees, its blinking red light the only sign of life in an otherwise still scene. A young black woman sat on the edge of a weathered wooden bench near the picnic tables, her shoulders hunched, her hands gripping the edges of her jacket. She looked like she wanted to disappear, her gaze darting around, as though searching for something or someone. No one else seemed to notice her unease. Travelers passed by without a second glance, some lost in their own worlds, others too distracted by phones or hurried schedules. But for anyone who did look closely, something about her posture told a silent story. Her body, though still, screamed tension, and her eyes, those wide, restless eyes, held a flicker of desperation, a plea for help that wasn't spoken aloud. That's when he saw her. Jason Keller was just another man passing through, blending in with the flow of weary road trippers. A former Marine, he had the build of someone who had spent years serving his country. A broad chest, a purposeful gait, and a sense of awareness that never quite left him. Though his days of military service were behind him, his instincts were sharp as ever. Years of training to read situations, assess risks, and act decisively didn't just fade away after hanging up the uniform. He hadn't planned to stop. His truck was running fine, and he still had a full thermos of coffee sitting in the cup holder. But something made him tap the brakes and pull into the lot. Maybe it was fatigue whispering for a break, or maybe it was that subtle tug in his gut he'd learned never to ignore. Jason parked his truck and climbed out, stretching his legs as he surveyed the rest stop. It seemed unremarkable, like countless others he'd seen on highways across the country. But then his eyes fell on her, the girl on the bench. Something about the way she sat caught his attention. Not just her stillness, but the way she seemed folded in on herself, like she was trying to shrink out of sight. Her left hand was clenched tightly around something, a scrap of paper. A napkin. He couldn't quite tell from this distance. He wasn't the kind of man to pry into strangers' business, but he'd seen enough in his life to know when something was off. He grabbed a bottle of water from his truck and decided to walk over, not entirely sure what he'd say. As he approached, he saw her stiffen slightly, her shoulders rising defensively. "Hey there," he said, keeping his tone light and casual. "Hot day, isn't it? You okay?" The girl didn't answer right away. Instead, her eyes darted to the parking lot, then to the road beyond, as though measuring her chances of escape. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Jason crouched slightly, putting himself at her eye level, and extended the water bottle. "You look like you could use this," he said gently. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Her fingers trembled as she reached for the bottle, and as she took it, Jason noticed what she'd been holding, a crumpled piece of paper with a single word scrawled across it in bold, shaky letters. *SOS*. His stomach tightened. This wasn't just a tired traveler or someone having a bad day. Something was very wrong. "Do you need help?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Her eyes darted again, this time landing on a sleek black car parked a short distance away. Inside, a man sat in the driver's seat, his fingers drumming impatiently on the steering wheel. Jason followed her gaze, his trained instincts kicking into high gear. The man in the car noticed Jason looking and gave a tight, almost rehearsed smile before glancing back at his phone. But Jason could feel it. Something wasn't right. The girl's body language, the crumpled SOS, and the man's calculated indifference painted a picture that set every alarm bell ringing in his head. "Do you know him?" Jason asked quietly. The girl shook her head. but her eyes filled with tears, betraying her fear. Jason straightened, his heart pounding. He was no stranger to dangerous situations, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield or a mission briefing. This was real life, and someone's safety was hanging in the balance. He glanced back at the man in the car, then down at the girl, who was now clutching the water bottle like it was a lifeline. "You stay here," Jason said firmly. "Don't move." And just like that, he was walking toward the black car, his steps measured, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know exactly what he was stepping into. But one thing was certain. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when someone needed him. Jason's boots crunched on the gravel as he approached the sleek black car. His every movement was deliberate, controlled, but his heart pounded like a drum in his chest. Years of training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, to evaluate a situation with precision and care. But this was something different. This wasn't a drill, and the stakes were real. The man in the driver's seat shifted slightly when Jason got close, adjusting his posture as if preparing for a confrontation. His sunglasses reflected the late afternoon sun, masking his expression. He looked like he belonged anywhere but here, clean-shaven, neatly dressed, and radiating a kind of quiet arrogance. Jason noticed the small things, the expensive watch on his wrist, the way his hands gripped the wheel just a little too tightly, the faint flicker of irritation that crossed his face when Jason came to a stop beside the car. "Afternoon," Jason said, his voice even. The man barely glanced up. "Afternoon," he replied curtly, his tone dismissive. Jason leaned slightly against the car, casually, but his eyes never left the man's face. "You waiting on someone?" he asked, his voice still calm, friendly even. The man's jaw tightened just for a second, but enough for Jason to notice. "Just taking a break," the man replied, forcing a thin smile. "Long drive." Jason nodded slowly, as if accepting the answer, but inside, his instincts were screaming. Something about the man felt off, too guarded, too polished for a rest stop like this. Jason could feel the tension radiating from him, a tension that didn't belong to someone casually passing through. "Nice car," Jason said, tapping lightly on the roof. "You see the weather report? Looks like a storm's coming in tonight." The man's eyes flickered toward the horizon, where dark clouds were beginning to gather. "Yeah, well, I'll be long gone by then," he said, his tone clipped. "Anything else I can help you with?" Jason straightened, letting the faintest edge creep into his smile. "No, I'm good. Just making sure everything's all right out here. You never know what kind of people you'll run into at these places." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Exactly," he said, before returning his attention to his phone, dismissing Jason entirely. Jason stood there for a moment longer, letting the silence hang between them before turning back toward the picnic tables. The girl on the bench hadn't moved. She sat frozen, clutching the bottle of water like it was her only anchor. Her gaze flitted to Jason as he approached, her expression a mixture of relief and raw fear. "He's not with you?" Jason asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. She shook her head. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't even know his name." She trailed off, her eyes welling with tears. Jason crouched down, lowering his voice to keep the conversation between them. "Okay," he said softly. "Take your time. You're safe now." She took a shaky breath, her hands fidgeting with a crumpled SOS note. "I got a ride with him," she said finally, her words halting. "I thought he was just being nice, but he wouldn't let me out of the car. He said we were stopping here for a break, but I don't think he plans on letting me go." Jason felt his stomach churn. It was worse than he thought. He glanced back toward the black car, where the man was still sitting, now scrolling idly on his phone. Every part of Jason wanted to march back over and drag the guy out by his collar, but he knew better than to act rashly. If he misstepped, the situation could escalate, and the girl could end up in even more danger. "Listen to me," Jason said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm going to help you. But I need to know, does he have anything? A weapon? Did he threaten you?" She shook her head quickly. "No, I don't think so. But he keeps his phone close. I think he's texting someone." Jason's mind raced. Was the man working alone, or was someone else involved? The possibilities made his skin crawl. He had to act fast but smart. "All right," he said, keeping his tone calm. "Do you have a phone? Someone you can call?" She hesitated, then pulled a small, older model phone from her jacket pocket. Jason's heart sank when he saw the cracked screen. "The battery's dead," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Jason nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. "Okay, stay here. Don't move. If anything happens, anything, you scream, and I'll be right back." The girl nodded, her grip tightening on the water bottle. Jason stood and walked briskly to his truck, his brain firing on all cylinders. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, stepping away from the truck to keep his voice low. "This is Jason Keller," he said when the operator picked up. "I'm at a rest stop off Highway 87, mile marker 210. I've got a young woman here. Looks like she might have been abducted. She's safe with me now, but the guy who picked her up is still here in a black sedan, acting suspicious. I need officers out here, ASAP." The operator's calm, methodical questions helped Jason focus. He described the situation in detail, giving them everything they needed to send help. By the time he hung up, his pulse was steady, his plan clear. Jason walked back to the girl, keeping an eye on the black car as he approached. The man hadn't moved, but Jason could feel his eyes on him, watching, waiting. Jason crouched beside the girl again, his voice low. "Help's on the way," he said. "You just need to sit tight a little longer." Her eyes widened. What if he tries to leave? What if "He won't," Jason interrupted gently but firmly. "I won't let that happen." She nodded, her hands trembling slightly. Jason sat down on the bench beside her, positioning himself between her and the car, making it clear to the man that he wasn't going anywhere. The minutes ticked by slowly, the air thick with tension. Jason kept his eyes trained on the black car, his body coiled like a spring, ready to act if the man made a move. And then, just as Jason's patience was beginning to fray, he saw the faint glint of blue and red lights in the distance. Help was here. But Jason knew this was far from over. Whatever had brought this girl to this rest stop, and whoever the man in the black car really was, it was only the beginning of a much larger story. As the flashing lights approached, the tension in the air thickened. Jason could see the man in the black car shift uneasily, his head turning slightly as he noticed the police cruiser. The girl beside Jason froze, clutching the edges of her jacket, like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Jason leaned closer to her, his voice steady but low. "Stay calm," he murmured. "This is a good thing. They'll take care of this." She nodded, but her eyes stayed locked on the man in the car. Her fear was palpable, but beneath it, Jason thought he caught a flicker of something else. Determination. She wasn't just scared. She was ready for this to end, one way or another. The cruiser pulled into the lot, its tires crunching on the gravel. Two officers stepped out, their movements brisk and professional. The lead officer, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, scanned the area, her gaze landing on Jason and the girl. Jason stood and raised a hand in greeting, making it clear he wasn't a threat. "You're the one who called?" the officer asked as she approached. Jason nodded. "Yeah, Jason Keller, former Marine." He gestured subtly toward the black car. "That man picked her up. She says he wouldn't let her leave. I've been keeping her safe until you got here." The officer's gaze shifted to the girl, who was still sitting on the bench, her hands tightly gripping the water bottle. "Is that true, miss?" she asked gently. The girl hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, he wouldn't stop the car. I asked him to, but he just kept driving. The officer's expression hardened, but she kept her tone calm and professional. All right, you're safe now. We'll handle this. Jason stepped back as the officers moved toward the black car. The second officer, a younger man with a careful, measured walk, approached the driver's side window. The man inside rolled it down just enough to speak, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. Jason couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see the tension building in the man's posture, the way his fingers tightened on the wheel. The lead officer joined her partner, and for a moment, it looked like the situation might resolve quietly. But then the man's voice rose, sharp and defensive. I don't know what you're talking about, he snapped, loud enough for Jason to catch. She got in my car willingly. This is ridiculous. Jason's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to stay where he was. He knew better than to interfere. The officers had this under control, he hoped. The lead officer's voice remained calm, but firm. Sir, step out of the vehicle. The man hesitated, his jaw working like he was chewing over his options. Jason could see the gears turning in his head, the way he was weighing whether to comply or make a run for it. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he pushed the door open and stepped out. As soon as he was clear of the car, the officers began a quick pat-down, their movements efficient and practiced. Jason's gaze flicked to the car's interior, scanning for anything out of place. There wasn't much: a phone on the dashboard, a coffee cup in the holder, but something about the neatness of it all felt wrong. Too clean, too calculated. Meanwhile, the girl on the bench watched the scene unfold with wide, unblinking eyes. Jason could feel the tension radiating off her, the way she gripped the water bottle so tightly her knuckles turned white. He crouched beside her again, keeping his voice low and calm. You're doing great, he said. Just stay strong a little longer. They'll make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else. She nodded, but her hands didn't loosen their grip. I didn't think anyone would stop, she admitted, her voice trembling. I thought no one would see me. Jason's chest tightened at her words. Well, I saw you, he said simply, and I wasn't going to just walk away. She managed a small, shaky smile, but it faded quickly as the officers began questioning the man. His voice grew louder, angrier, as he insisted he'd done nothing wrong. She's lying, he shouted, his face flushing red. I was just giving her a ride. She didn't say anything about wanting to get out. Jason's jaw tightened, but he kept his focus on the girl. It's almost over, he assured her. Just a little longer. The officers, however, weren't backing down. The lead officer gestured toward the car, asking for permission to search it. The man's reaction was immediate and telling. He stepped back, his hands flying up defensively. You can't do that. You don't have a warrant. Jason's stomach sank. The man's sudden panic told him everything he needed to know. There was something in that car he didn't want them to find. Something that might explain the fear in the girl's eyes and the desperation in her whispered words. The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable, but Jason could see the wheels turning. They didn't need a warrant if they had probable cause, and this man was practically waving a red flag. The lead officer turned to the girl, her tone soft but serious. Miss, do you know if he has anything in the car? Anything that could be dangerous? The girl hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the car before returning to the officer. I don't know, she admitted. But he was texting someone. I think he was planning something. The officer's expression darkened, and she nodded sharply. Thank you. Stay right here, okay? The girl nodded, and the officer turned back to her partner. Jason watched as they conferred briefly before the younger officer moved toward the car. He opened the door carefully, his movements cautious but deliberate. The lead officer kept a close watch on the man, whose protests grew louder and more frantic. Jason held his breath as the officer searched the car, his hands moving methodically over the seats and floor. It didn't take long for him to find something, a small black duffel bag tucked under the passenger seat. He pulled it out and set it on the hood of the car, unzipping it slowly. What he found inside made Jason's stomach churn. Though he couldn't see everything from where he stood, he caught glimpses: duct tape, rope, a roll of plastic bags. His heart sank as the pieces started to click into place. This wasn't just a case of a man picking up the wrong hitchhiker. This was something much darker. The lead officer's expression turned steely as she turned to the man. "Care to explain this?" she asked, her voice cold. The man stammered, his confidence unraveling with each passing second. "It's not what it looks like. I use that stuff for work." The officer raised an eyebrow. What kind of work? Jason could see the cracks forming in the man's facade, the way his bluster gave way to desperation. He wasn't a seasoned criminal. He was someone who thought he could get away with something terrible, and now he was realizing he couldn't. The girl on the bench let out a shaky breath, her hands loosening their grip on the water bottle for the first time. Jason placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, silently vowing to stay by her side until this was truly over. The lead officer crouched beside the girl, her tone shifting to one of careful reassurance. "You've been really brave through all of this. I need to ask you a few more questions, but we'll go at your pace. Can you tell me how you ended up in his car?" The girl hesitated, her fingers gripping the bench beneath her, as though she needed something solid to hold onto. She took a shaky breath before answering. "I was walking along the highway. It was getting dark, and I didn't think anyone would stop to help me. But then he pulled over. He seemed nice at first, asking where I was going, if I needed a ride." Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she forced herself to continue. "I told him I didn't need to go far, just to the next town. He said that was fine. But then, after a while, I realized he wasn't heading toward the town. He kept saying he had to take a different route. When I asked him to stop and let me out, he wouldn't. He just kept driving." The officer's face remained calm, but Jason didn't miss the way her jaw tightened at the girl's words. "You're doing great," the officer said gently. "Did he say anything to you while he was driving? Anything that made you feel unsafe?" The girl nodded, her hands clenching into fists. He kept asking questions, like if anyone knew where I was or if I had a family nearby. He told me I should be grateful he picked me up, because not everyone would be so kind. Jason felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral for the girl's sake. The officer nodded, her voice steady and soothing. "Thank you for telling me that. You're safe now, and we'll make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else." Jason stood as the officer returned to her partner, who was securing the duffel bag as evidence. The man in cuffs was still shouting, his voice hoarse from yelling. "This is a setup. You're ruining my life for no reason. That girl's lying." The lead officer ignored his outburst, but Jason could see the other officer's patience wearing thin. He stepped closer to the girl, blocking her view of the man. "Don't let him get in your head," he said quietly. "He's just trying to scare you. He knows he's caught." The girl nodded again, but her eyes were glassy with unshed tears. "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I didn't think I'd get away." Jason's throat tightened. "You're away now. That's what matters." Before he could say more, the lead officer's radio crackled, and she stepped aside to take the call. Jason couldn't hear all of it, but the words "plate check" and "possible link" stood out. The officer's face darkened as she turned back to her partner, gesturing for him to follow her a few steps away. Their low voices carried a sense of urgency, and Jason's instincts told him this situation was even bigger than it seemed. A few minutes later, the lead officer approached Jason, her expression serious. "We've got reason to believe this isn't his first time," she said quietly. "There's a case in another state with a similar vehicle description. A girl who went missing was last seen getting into a car like his. Jason's heart sank at her words. So what happens now? He asked. We're coordinating with detectives from the other jurisdiction, she explained. If they confirm a match, he'll be facing charges there too. But right now, we're focusing on her safety. She glanced toward the girl, who was sitting silently on the bench, her head bowed. Jason nodded. What can I do? Stay with her, the officer said. She's been through a lot, and she trusts you. That's important. Jason returned to the girl's side, sitting on the bench, this time to make himself less imposing. He handed her a fresh bottle of water from the bag he'd brought, and she accepted it with a faint, grateful smile. For a while, they sat in silence, the distant sounds of the officers' radios filling the air. But then Jason noticed something, a movement out of the corner of his eye. The man in cuffs, who had been relatively quiet for the past few minutes, was shifting his weight, inching toward the edge of the patrol car where he was leaning. His hands, though bound, were fidgeting near his pockets. Jason stood abruptly, his instincts kicking in. Officer, he called, his voice sharp. The lead officer spun around just as the man lunged, trying to bolt toward the tree line at the edge of the rest stop. Her reaction was immediate, chasing after him while her partner radioed for backup. Jason stayed where he was, shielding the girl and keeping his eyes on the unfolding chaos. The man didn't get far. The lead officer tackled him to the ground with precision, pinning him as her partner ran to assist. Jason felt a rush of relief as they secured him again, this time with even less leniency. But that relief was short-lived as he turned back to the girl and saw her trembling. It's okay, Jason said quickly. They've got him. He's not going anywhere. She nodded, but her breathing was shallow, and she looked like she might collapse. Jason crouched in front of her, keeping his voice calm and steady. Hey, focus on me. You're safe. He's caught. Just breathe. Slowly, her breathing evened out, and she gave a shaky nod. Jason stayed with her until the officers returned, the man now securely placed in the back of the cruiser. The lead officer approached, her face set in a grim expression. We'll be taking him in, she said, and we'll need her to give a full statement. Can you come with her? She seems comfortable with you. Jason didn't hesitate. Of course, whatever she needs. The girl glanced at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. For the first time, there was a hint of relief in her expression, though the weight of what she'd been through was still heavy on her shoulders. Jason placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as they prepared to leave, knowing the road ahead would be long but determined to see her through it. Jason guided the girl toward the squad car, keeping a protective arm near her shoulder as they prepared to leave. Her steps were hesitant, her gaze darting nervously around the rest stop, like she was still expecting something to go wrong. Jason felt the same unease settling into his gut, a sense that there was more to this than any of them had realized. The lead officer paused to make a call, her voice sharp and authoritative, as she updated someone on the situation. Meanwhile, the girl clung to Jason's side, a fragile trust in him anchoring her amidst the chaos. Jason glanced back at the black car still parked in the lot, its trunk slightly ajar after the officer's search. Something about it nagged at him, though he couldn't quite place why. Officer, he called out cautiously. The lead officer turned, still holding the radio to her ear. Are you sure you checked the entire car? He seemed like the type to. I don't know, hide something. Her brow furrowed. We gave it a preliminary search. The rest will be done at the station. Why? Jason hesitated, unsure how to explain the feeling gnawing at him. I've seen men like him before. They're calculated. He was trying to get away for a reason. The officer considered this for a moment, then motioned to her partner. Double-check the vehicle before we leave, she instructed. The younger officer nodded, heading back toward the car with a flashlight in hand. Jason and the girl stayed near the cruiser as the officer began her search. The flashlight beam cut through the growing darkness, scanning over the interior and then dipping toward the trunk. Jason kept his eyes on the officer, watching her movements closely. It wasn't long before the officer froze, the flashlight hovering over something deep in the trunk. Jason couldn't see what it was from where he stood, but the officer's body language told him everything he needed to know. She found something, and it wasn't good. The lead officer hurried over, her voice low but firm. Jason caught fragments of their conversation. Secondary bag, unaccounted for, and possible connection. The younger officer pulled something from the trunk, carefully wrapped in a dark cloth. "What is it?" Jason asked, his voice tight. The lead officer approached, her expression grim. "More supplies," she said simply, "similar to what was in the duffel bag. But there's also a burner phone. That's troubling." Jason's stomach sank. "Burner phone? What does that mean?" "It means," she said, her tone clipped, "he could be in contact with someone else. Someone who might have been part of whatever he was planning." The girl gasped, clutching Jason's arm tightly. "You think there's more of them?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The officer didn't answer directly. "We're going to check the phone for recent activity. But for now, let's get you to the station. You'll be safe there." Jason nodded, helping the girl into the back seat of the squad car. He could feel her shaking beside him, her fear as raw as it had been when he first found her. "We're not out of the woods yet," he thought grimly, his instincts telling him this was far from over. As the cruiser pulled onto the highway, the lead officer's radio crackled again, this time with an urgent tone. The dispatcher's voice was sharp, delivering a message that made Jason's blood run cold. "We've received a report of a second vehicle matching a similar description, spotted near the state border. Possible accomplice. Proceed with caution." Jason's heart pounded as he glanced at the officer in the driver's seat. Her grip on the wheel tightened, her jaw set in a hard line. "An accomplice?" Jason asked, his voice low but steady. The officer nodded grimly. "It's possible. We've seen cases like this before. One person acts as the bait, while another waits nearby to finish the job." Jason felt the girl tense beside him, her breathing quickening. He reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "They won't get to you," he said firmly. "Not while I'm here." The cruiser sped toward the station, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through their fingers. If there was someone else out there, someone who knew about the girl, they might not be far behind. When they arrived at the station, the officers quickly ushered the girl inside, securing her in a small interview room for her safety. Jason stayed by her side, his presence a silent promise that he wouldn't leave her alone. But as the officers worked, piecing together evidence and cross-referencing details, the tension in the air grew heavier. The burner phone yielded little information, just a series of cryptic messages and a few missed calls. One message stood out, though, its contents chilling in its simplicity. Asterisk asterisk confirm when done. Location clear. Asterisk asterisk. Jason's gut twisted. "That's a signal," he said aloud. "Whoever sent that message is waiting for confirmation, and if they don't get it..." The lead officer finished his thought. "They might come looking." Jason glanced at the girl, who was sitting silently in the corner of the room, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked small and vulnerable, but there was a spark of resilience in her eyes, a determination to survive this nightmare. Before Jason could say anything more, an officer burst into the room, his face pale. "We've got a problem," he announced. "The second vehicle. It's been spotted less than 10 miles from here." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation settling over them like a heavy fog. Jason stood, his posture rigid and alert. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. The lead officer's expression was grim but resolute. "We prepare," she said, "and we make sure she's safe, no matter what." Jason nodded, his resolve hardening. Whatever was coming, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this girl face it alone. The minutes ticked by like hours. Jason's nerves were on edge as he paced the small room, glancing every few seconds at the girl, who was still sitting quietly, but with her hands now clenched tightly in her lap. The room was thick with tension, the air buzzing with the weight of what was coming. Outside, officers were already mobilizing. Some had gone to check the perimeter, others were contacting backup. The lead officer stood near the door, a radio crackling in her hand. She seemed focused, but her eyes occasionally darted toward the girl, lingering there, concern evident. Jason's mind raced. He knew they had to act quickly, but the clock was ticking down, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The second vehicle was close now, maybe too close. The girl shifted in her seat, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't think they'll stop, even now." Jason turned to her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" She met his eyes, her expression a mix of fear and something darker, something that Jason couldn't quite place. "I thought I could run," she said, her voice trembling. "But I can't. It's already too late, isn't it?" Jason didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward, kneeling in front of her so he could look into her eyes. "You're safe here," he said firmly, though doubt gnawed at him. "No one's getting to you. Not while I'm here." Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something more, but then the sound of a door slamming shut outside the room cut through the silence. Jason's heart skipped a beat. The footsteps were heavy, determined. The lead officer entered the room, her face pale but resolute. "They're here." "The second vehicle," she said, her voice steady despite the urgency. "We've got them cornered in the parking lot, but it won't be long before they try to move." Jason stood quickly, his gaze snapping to the girl. "Stay here. I mean it." But as he turned to leave, the girl's voice stopped him cold. "You don't understand," she said, her tone suddenly sharp, almost urgent. "They're not after me." Jason froze. "What do you mean?" "I'm not who you think I am," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm not the victim." The words hit Jason like a punch to the stomach. His mind reeled, unable to process what she was saying. "What are you talking about?" She swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the room, as if searching for the right words. "I'm part of this. I was supposed to get away, but She took a shaky breath. "I was supposed to lead them here." Jason's world tilted, his thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. The girl who he thought he had saved wasn't a victim at all. She was the bait. Before he could respond, there was a loud crash outside, followed by shouts and the rapid sound of boots on the ground. The officers rushed to the door, pushing Jason and the girl back as they scrambled to secure the area. The girl stood, her posture suddenly more confident, more deliberate. "I tried to get out," she said, almost as if talking to herself. "But there was no way to escape. They would have found me." Jason stared at her, trying to make sense of everything. "You're telling me you've been in this the whole time?" She nodded. "I didn't want this. I didn't want to hurt anyone. But it's too late. They've been controlling me, using me." Her voice broke, and for a brief moment, Jason saw the girl he had initially wanted to protect. The girl who had been trapped in a dangerous situation she couldn't escape. But now, the girl standing before him was something else. Something more dangerous. Suddenly, the door to the room burst open. One of the officers was standing there, his face pale. "They're inside," he said, panic in his eyes. "They've breached the perimeter. We need to move now." The girl's lips curled into a faint smile, but it was cold, knowing. "It's too late," she said. "They're already here." Jason's heart pounded. The twist, everything he thought he knew, was crushing down on him. The girl wasn't a helpless victim. She was part of the plan. As the officers rushed to prepare for the incoming threat, Jason realized that the real danger wasn't just outside the door. It was standing right in front of him. The girl who had seemed so fragile, so innocent, was one of them. Before he could react, the girl stepped forward, her eyes narrowing with a cold intensity he hadn't seen before. She pulled something from her jacket, a small, sleek device. She held it up for Jason to see. "This was the signal," she whispered, pressing a button on the device. In that instant, the entire building seemed to shake. The walls trembled, the lights flickered. Jason's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. The building wasn't just under siege, it was a trap. The girl stepped back, a dark glimmer in her eyes. "I didn't want this, but I had no choice." Jason rushed forward, his mind racing. He reached for her, but she was already gone, vanishing into the shadows of the station's back hallway, leaving behind only chaos in her wake. Outside, the sound of sirens and gunfire erupted. The officers were under attack from all sides. Jason stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation crushing over him. He had been played just like everyone else. The girl, no, the operative, had led him straight into the heart of the enemy's plan. As the first wave of attackers stormed through the doors, Jason realized that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. And the most terrifying thought of all, he had no idea who the real enemy was anymore. Jason's mind raced as the world around him erupted into chaos. The sirens outside grew louder, mingling with the frantic voices of the officers trying to regain control. But Jason couldn't move. His entire body was frozen in place by the shocking turn of events. The girl, no, the operative, had disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but confusion and betrayal. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. He had to act. If he stood here any longer, it would be too late for everyone. Jason sprinted toward the hallway where the girl had vanished, his footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. He could hear muffled voices ahead, the sound of movement, but he wasn't sure if they were allies or enemies. Every instinct told him to trust no one, not anymore. As he rounded a corner, Jason caught sight of a figure in the distance. The girl. No, she was no longer the scared hitchhiker he tried to help. She was someone else now, someone in control. But Jason wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. "Stop," he shouted, his voice rough from the adrenaline pumping through him. The girl paused, turning slowly to face him. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes hard, like she completely shed whatever vulnerability had once been there. Jason couldn't believe how quickly she had transformed. In the span of a few hours, she'd gone from a terrified victim to a cold, calculating figure. "You really thought you could save me, didn't you?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. "You thought you were the hero. But you never knew the full story, Jason. You never knew what was really going on." Jason took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm not going to let you do this. Not now, not after everything." She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You don't get it. You were just a pawn in all of this, Jason. You were never meant." A cold shiver ran down his spine. "Lead them. What are you talking about?" Her eyes glinted, and for the first time, Jason saw a flicker of something human, something close to regret. "The people you've been protecting. They aren't the real good guys here. And neither am I. We've all been playing a game." Jason's pulse quickened. "What game? Who are you really working for?" Before she could answer, the sound of footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. Jason spun around, his heart racing. A group of armed men rounded the corner, their faces covered, their weapons raised. They weren't officers. They were the ones the girl had been working with all along. The girl's eyes flicked toward the men and then back to Jason, a small but knowing smirk on her face. "I'm sorry, Jason, but I can't let you stop us now." With a sudden, unexpected movement, she pulled a gun from beneath her jacket. aiming it squarely at Jason. His body froze in place, every muscle tense, every instinct telling him to move. But he couldn't. The situation was slipping out of his hands faster than he could process. "You really thought you could save the day, huh?" she said again, her voice almost mocking. "But you were never the one in control. You were just a distraction." Jason's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. He couldn't fight back. Not with the gun trained on him. Not with the armed men closing in. He was outnumbered and outgunned. But something in him refused to give up. He had to try. Suddenly, he heard shouting from behind him. Officers. They were coming, their voices clear now, as they moved swiftly through the hallway. Jason's heart leaped. Maybe, just maybe, he had a chance. Without hesitation, he lunged to the side, throwing himself into a roll as he heard the crack of gunfire. The bullet grazed his arm, but he pushed through the pain, his body hitting the ground hard. In the distance, the officers burst into the hallway, their weapons drawn. A gunfight erupted in the cramped space, echoing off the walls. Jason scrambled to his feet, ignoring the sting in his arm as he ducked behind a nearby pillar. The girl was gone, disappeared into the chaos. But Jason didn't stop to look for her. He couldn't afford to. The officers were engaged in the firefight, their focus on the men who had been behind the girl all along. Jason knew this was his chance. He couldn't waste it. He sprinted toward the exit, weaving through the chaos, his mind clear despite the madness around him. The truth was beginning to settle in. He had been a part of something far bigger than he had ever realized. The girl, the black car, the duffel bag. It had all been a calculated move, a diversion to bring the real players into position. And now those players had been exposed. Outside, the sounds of the battle still rang through the air. But as Jason reached the safety of a nearby alley, he paused, breathing heavily. The girl was still out there, but she wasn't his responsibility anymore. Jason had done what he could. He'd done what he thought was right. But sometimes, no matter how hard you try to save someone, the truth isn't what it seems. Jason leaned against the cold brick wall, his heart still pounding. He could hear sirens in the distance, officers rounding up the remaining criminals. But the battle wasn't over. There was still a web of lies to untangle, a conspiracy to expose. As he stood there, taking in the night air, he realized the story wasn't over for him. The questions weren't finished. He would have to figure out who the real enemies were, who was behind the girl's manipulation, and why it had all come down to this. For now, though, he knew one thing for sure. He had made a choice, and no matter what came next, that was all he could control. The girl was just another player in a game too complicated for him to fully understand. But Jason wasn't done. Not yet. He'd find the answers. And when he did, he wouldn't be just a pawn anymore. He'd be the one pulling the strings. But that was a fight for another day. For now, he could only wait for the next move.